All right, so what a fantastic topic. We've been talking about skills and becoming this really dynamic organization and what does the future look like. And I know they gave a really brief introduction, but maybe a little deeper introduction of what is your specific role in Chevron. And let's just take it from there. So Luis, maybe you first.
Sure. So I'm Luis Niño. I'm the manager for the HR digital office in Chevron. As such, we're charged with driving the digital transformation for our HR function to understand how we can disrupt may not be the right word, but evolve our workflows in HR across the whole function and deliver service outcomes for the corporation.
Fantastic. And Charlotte?
Yeah, so Charlotte Gerstner, I am responsible for talent management at the enterprise level. So we have a learning and talent COE, as many other organizations do, and I'm one of the leadership members of that COE. So I have a peer who's responsible for talent acquisition and another who's responsible for learning and development. And maybe just a little bit by way of background so you can kind of situate my perspective. I am going into my third year at Chevron in this role, but for over 20 years, I was an external consultant in the talent and leadership space. So I'm an organizational psychologist by training, and my perspective is a little bit more on the talent assessment and talent development side of the house.
No, that is fantastic. And, one of the big questions is always, when we talk to companies on the Josh Bersin side, everybody's approaching skills from a different perspective. So maybe just a little bit of context. Why this focus on skills at Chevron? What's going on that's driving these conversations in your activity?
That's a great question. Yeah. So I think maybe some context as to where we started.
Okay.
When we first started talking to Eightfold a few years ago, we were looking at the opportunity to understand the talent that was coming into Chevron, not actually our internal talent.
Okay.
And that drove the conversation to how do we get to know our people better? And that's why we sort of got very enamored with the topic of advancing skills recognition and advancement and inference and understanding. And little by little, we started figuring out that this was something that was going to impact every workflow in HR, and then impact how we look at the corporation going forward, right? So we really dug deep, started having conversations with you guys and many other organizations to figure out what are skills, because they are, even though we've had this concept of skills forever, the catalysts from a technology perspective and from a behavioral perspective are different this time. We now have, and I think Josh talked about this in his keynote, the technology to really scale this and drive data-driven, informed decisions, where before we were somewhat comfortable calling this art. Okay. And so balancing that equation helped.
No, this is really fascinating. And, as I put it together in my mind in a very simple way, you started with the external, and now we're really focused also on the internal. Any thoughts or comments on that? Charlotte, maybe you want to take point on that one?
Sure. And, I want to say that we are still very early in this journey, as I think most companies are. As I talk to my peers, we're all having, some version of the same experience. And what's interesting from an internal perspective is that skills, in the broader sense of skills, have always been really critical for us. We're a very technical organization, so a lot of that really is about technical capability, and it's important. It's important from a safety perspective, from a risk management and operational efficiency perspective. So we have always been very focused on skills. However, in a way, our current processes are kind of crumbling under their own weight, to be honest, because we've got these really complex competency assessments, and every function has their own, and there's a lot of overlap, and there's a lot of manual effort that's required. So we are in a place where we're really trying to, it's not one or the other, it's going to be a both and world, but we're trying to see how can we automate more of this? How can we make it more user-friendly? And quite frankly, we need our people to be more agile than the traditional competency assessment approach really allows them to be. And then the last thing I will say is we also, from an internal perspective, realize that we've really looked at skills or skills and competencies historically as being tied to a job that someone does and not necessarily tied to the person. And if we want people to be able to have options and there to be, flexibility for where people go, we need to be able to understand for a person, what does that whole set of capabilities, interests, motivations look like. And I think where we're going in the skills world based on technology like Eightfold will allow us to have that holistic picture at the individual level. It'll still be important at times to have those job-focused models or those function-focused models for specific applications, but we're really trying to figure out how, how both can coexist and what's really the use case for each.
The statement you made there is truly transformative around the skills attached to the individual when we have probably 150, 200 years worth of legacy of skills being attached to a job. And so organizations are just stuck in that mental mindset, and it's a hard journey for a lot of folks to kind of go through that. I'm curious, because we get this question all the time, and you're slightly ahead of many people, but it's still a long journey ahead of us. Where do you start in this conversation with the organization? How do you approach this? Because this is hard.
Anywhere you can.
I think for us, like I said, it was sort of an organic progression, starting out with the external requirement. When we first talked to you guys, we were actually looking for a CRM capability, and it was pulling on a thread, right? Because when we found that we had the opportunity to, like I said, and it should be, we should remind people often of the purpose here. We had the opportunity to understand talent better, then some of those silos became less rigid, right? And so now we could talk about internal talent and external talent, and in the same sentence. These things traditionally have been separate, right? And so if you want to start outside because that's where you have the need, if you want to start inside because that's where you have the need, that's absolutely fine, as long as you have the long-term vision here of there is a unified approach to talent. It doesn't really matter where it comes from, and eventually it won't really matter the kind of relationship that you have with that talent. And so some of them will be employees, a lot of them are already contractors that are part of our talent ecosystem. And what you want to do here is you want to remove the barriers so that you can take advantage of that talent wherever it comes from. And so that's, from an engagement perspective, that's what you have to keep in mind depending on who you're talking to.
All right, I'm going to pull on this thread just a little bit more because I know this is always a really tough topic. Luckily, you've been on this journey for a little while. Any kind of ahas around, boy, if I had to go back and do that over again, is there something that you learned along the way that may be helpful for everyone else as they embark on this journey?
Well, I think, one of the things we've clearly learned is that, as Luis was just saying, this concept of skills touches so many different processes. And that means that, in a big organization, there are so many people and groups who need to be included in the conversation. I think we've done a pretty good job. Our culture is already set up that way that, we do a lot of stakeholder engagement, but for sure, you need a broad cross-section of people from across HR, from the business, functional experts in our case as well. So, start the conversation early and go big tent in terms of the stakeholders that you're bringing in. I think the other thing that we talk about a lot, we were just having this conversation at breakfast, is, every organization already has legacy processes that, have used some version of a skill or a competency or something analogous to it. And those things can be very sticky in an organization. So we really have to think about, how do we attach this to some of those processes, at least as a starting point, because we couldn't really just go in and take existing legacy processes out if people really, were still using them and felt that they were adding value. So it's not, again, it's not an either or kind of conversation. It's a how can we enhance what's already happening in some of our legacy processes by bringing this data in. So I think it's finding those places where, something is already working well, and people are doing it, and can you make it work even better when you bring the intelligence that the skills data can bring?
Yeah, I think I think if you and for us, and something that I think we did somewhat organically at the beginning, but then formalized, was this idea of diverse thinking in the room when we were thinking about skills and the potential impact. Because you can run the risk of being narrow when you're making decisions on technology, for example, and then figuring out that you missed opportunities to expand the impact of a technology like Eightfold or some of the other skills-driven platforms that go beyond your original thinking. So we put together, we're big on the concept of teaming in Chevron. Okay. We put together a team of teams that came from very different parts of the organization: L&D, TM, TA, our technical talent management organization, some customers themselves. And we just let them think about what this strategy was going to look like. We felt like we needed to start there before we just threw technology at the problem, right? And that has bode really well for us. It has really allowed us to upskill some of the practitioners, but also educate our senior leaders on the impact that this will have in the next few years.
Let me just double click on that. So do you mind, love the idea of introducing diverse thinking, team of teams. You're taking them on an intellectual journey to, I imagine, expand the way they think about skills and its use and implications. Can you bring us into one of those sessions and just kind of give us some insights as to what really went on and how did you navigate that?
Well, yeah, as very chaotic at the beginning.
It's messy.
Very chaotic. You touched on something that I think is really important. Organizations like ours, we don't start from scratch, right? And some of the things that we've put in place, like our competency assessment systems, have been there because they need to be. We depend on those for reliability. We depend on those for safety. These are big staples of industries like ours, and they will remain there. And so we had different appetites for change in the room. And we needed that because we really needed to test ourselves and some of the assumptions. There's people like me that just want to run with it. And then there's people that are driving us to be more paused and think about the impact out in the field and with the practitioners. So very chaotic at the beginning. As you go through it and you trust the people that are in the room, you manage to organize your thoughts. And one of the things I like to remind the team about often is what I said at the beginning, like 3 times already, which is this is about understanding our people better. This is about understanding our talent. And so if you're in the learning space, if you're in the TA space, wherever you are, think about what this does to achieve that purpose. And then the technology will sort itself out, hopefully. The processes will sort themselves out. But the purpose of what we're looking for here needs to be front and center.
No, I love the honesty around the chaotic piece there, right? Because in our role, we sit in on many webinars with organizations going through the same process, different parts of the journey. And in the beginning, it is always messy. Right? You bring 12 or 14 people together, all with different perspectives. Some of them kind of get it. Some of them don't understand it. Some of them have different, political agendas, not in a negative way, but they're responsible for different things. And you just got to let that process work out. And the key takeaway I always remind, the stakeholders is this is part of change. You got to just put it on the table and then start sorting it out. And Charlotte, you mentioned earlier about stakeholders, so maybe I can just double click on stakeholders. Maybe a little bit of perspective of, are there themes that you are hearing over and over again from different stakeholder groups, and how did you bring them on the journey? Any insights there as you thought about the different stakeholders as they've come on this journey with you? Not saying that they're all there yet, but as they decided to at least get on the bus with you and start heading down the road.
Yeah, I think for our business leaders, they just want us to make it simple for them. So they get frustrated when, we use different terminology and we talk about different processes. So in that case, we're really trying to help them understand how this can simplify. This can bring different things together and, give them more information than they had before for less work and pain, hopefully. So I think that's important. I think, with respect to our HR stakeholders, because, frankly, we have a lot of stakeholder engagement we need to do within the HR function, a lot of it is education about what different platforms can do. You know, the visual that Josh showed in the keynote this morning, I think is really critical. And Luis has been great about showing versions of that and really educating our HR colleagues because there is a perception that, you know, we're a Workday shop, that Workday should be able to do all of these things. And we know that's not the case. That's not really the intent, but not everyone realizes that. So that's another key stakeholder group.
Yeah, I think when you say stakeholders, my mind goes to personas.
Okay.
Because I try to organize it mentally. When I think about the employee, we're really trying to focus on the employee experience, the journeys that they go through. If it's a prospect coming into the organization, how do we make that journey one of learning and upskilling? How do we bring the knowledge of the interview phases and all those into that person's career development, right? If you're talking about an established employee, how do you make sure that this doesn't become like taxes, where you go into the system twice a year or something and you just have to go through that, but rather a continuous experience of learning and upskilling, whether you're going to do that through gigs or a job or learning items, that it's connected, right? And so from a customer-centric perspective, I really think of our employees first. But then obviously we think about the supervisor and the hiring manager and the talent managers in our organization that need to look more holistically about, do we have the right skill sets in place for now? How are we tackling this challenge of emerging skills? Chevron's really big on how are we going to prepare ourselves for the energy transition, right? We have a new organization called Chevron New Energies that's looking at this. How do we make sure that we find those transferable skills in the people that we have already so that they can move on and we build a bridge between these two things that are front and center for us?
No, that's absolutely fascinating. And one of the things you and I were talking about right before we came in here, and Charlotte, we talked about it in that little forum yesterday, is there is change happening inside the HR organization. Verticals that historically, maybe not at Chevron, but historically in many organizations, they were verticals around, you know, talent acquisition, there was learning, there was succession, there was leadership development, on and on and on. Josh brought it up this morning. It's forcing organizations to think about the horizontal connectedness to deliver on the dream of what this could be for skills. Any thoughts or insights you want to share with that, and how painful is it to go through that journey?
Well, you're absolutely right, Bill. And this is actually something that we're talking about very close to home. We're talking about it within our COE because, you know, here we are, you know, ostensibly the experts in learning and talent. And we have our verticals, you know, we have our spaces, as you said. We have learning and development, we have talent management. And Chevron, I will say, is, you know, a very hierarchical organization, and that permeates every function. So we find ourselves in a difficult place to deliver on what we know is best for the employee and is best for supervisors because of our structure. And we are actually right now talking about how do we probably can't change our structure easily or quickly, but how do we organize around the work to be done? So we're kicking off a number of Agile work streams that cut across the various areas of the COE, and we'll also bring in people from other parts of HR, people from our functions and our business to actually work together on the real issues. And even though that won't be aligned with our formal structure, we feel like that's really how the work is getting done. And I think you see that, you know, we certainly see that in our IT function and other places in the business already.
Yeah, I mean, I think you think of hierarchy and org structures and other sort of industrial era constructs that help us understand the work, right? And then you think of these catalysts and others. I think there are also cultural catalysts, the servant leadership that's come into our organization, this idea about teaming and focusing on outcomes. So one of the things we're doing very deliberately is understanding how we can focus better on outcomes regardless of where you sit in the organization. That's something that we're doing in HR. We've been doing it for a while. And while we set up the COEs, like the Learning and Talent COE in Chevron, we also have a TR COE in Chevron, we're starting to understand that those things are required to give that sense of stability to the organization, but we really need to cut across and understand what is the customer-centric outcome we're trying to optimize here. And so if we can be clear about that, and if we can explain to people how they make part of that chain, that value chain, it's going to be easier to team, and we're going to start reducing that over-indexing on the organizational structure that we've had for a long time.
You know, it's interesting because Josh even mentioned it in his conversation this morning with all of us, that, you know, as you get deeper and deeper, you start bumping into traditional hierarchies and organizational and job architecture models. And it's kind of, you know, challenging norms that we've had out there for a very long period of time. I'm going to put that aside for a second because you did earlier talk about the chaos. And again, I'm so glad that you were honest about that because it's a process we go through. Let's jump to the future. So what does success look like in the future? What gets you so you're doing this for a reason because you have a passion for it, but what does success look like in the future on this?
So I'll start with one picture of it, and I think it actually addresses one of your earlier questions about, like, you know, how do you get started? And I think one of the most pressing issues for those of us in the talent space now is the, you know, the decrease in employee engagement and the attrition challenge. You know, we see that everywhere. So we also know from the data that one of the biggest drivers of engagement is feeling like you have opportunities to develop. So for me, one of the, you know, the markers of success will be that our employees feel like they have options, that they have an easy way to understand what's out there, to understand where they are relative to those opportunities, and what they would need to do to close any gaps. So it would mean, you know, our systems are working together, and, you know, they're able to go in, you know, regardless of what the interface looks like, but they're able to go in and get this data. It's talking to our learning management system, and they can, you know, they can find courses, they can find mentors, and really have the information and tools that they need to own their career. That's one of the ways that I believe will be successful through this. There are many other markers, but we'd be interested.
No, I love it. I love everything you said. I think, to me, again, customer centricity, front and center, the employee. We've, for a few years now, us and many other organizations have talked about on tapping into intrinsic motivation. Yep. Purpose, mastery, autonomy, right? And so, to me, when I think of these things, I envision us providing the tools to our people so that they can have a stronger purpose and more connected to the work that they do, have the autonomy and the knowledge necessary to do their work, and have the skills at their disposal to achieve mastery on the field that they want to chase. So if we get to that future where these tools are put in the hands of the employee to achieve those, I'll be pretty happy.
Yeah, and if the business is coming and asking for more versus saying, why are you making me do all these things? Then we'll have been successful.
There you go. You know, we've been on a little bit of a journey here. We talked at the very beginning on how you started this up, some of the insights you learned along the way. We were honest about the chaos in the beginning as people just have to, like, understand what's going on here. We talked about stakeholders, a little bit of the vision for the future there. One of the questions I get quite often, is this a project or a new standing process in the organization? Any thoughts? And you laughed, so obviously this has come up. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I'll answer, well, actually, no, this is definitely not a project. This is not a fad that's gonna, you know, come in and out of our organization, at least. I think we understand that skills can be the building block, the unit of data to help us understand people. If we can document them, and we're very good at this, by the way. I've heard it in the conference. It's been said a couple times, this analogy with time series data. Yep. For people who are in manufacturing and production spaces, we've been leveraging time series data for decades. We're very good at it. So if we have that mindset of using this data as real-time information about our people, there's no way we can go back from that. And so what we need to think about is, how do we adjust? How do we shift? How do we align? In some places, how do we disrupt based on the data that that is now informing our insights?
Got it. Additional thoughts on that?
I agree with what Luis said. I mean, it may be initially a project just to get it started, but I think it's not that longer term. It really is a change in the way that we work.
As so many organizations are really in the beginning of this journey here, maybe just taking a step back at the most macro view, what kind of advice would you give somebody sitting now in your chair and they're like, oh my goodness, I'm about ready to embark on this? What words of wisdom can you impart?
I think we touched on a couple of things. I think on the technology side, make sure that you understand your architecture. Make sure you understand the experience that you're trying to build for your employees and supervisors and leaders, and make sure that it's cohesive and open. I forget which session discussed this. I think it was the Forrester session where they talked about some of the characteristics of a platform. And one of the things they talked about was the openness of the platform. To me, that's very, very important. With all due respect to every technology company, nobody does everything. And so this opportunity to have a loosely coupled architecture that allows these systems to come together, talk to each other, and deliver an experience, that's a big lesson that we're still trying to go through, by the way. This is not like we solved it. And then on the change management side, I think you can talk about the change management side, but it's by far the biggest challenge. You mentioned some of the established and entrenched processes and practices, but maybe you can talk a little bit more about that change management effort.
Well, it's, and as a psychologist, I know this, right? Is the hard part is the people, getting them to do something different. I think, I don't know if I'll answer the question directly, but to build on what you said, Luis, first of all, I think you have to have a really strong partnership between the SMEs and technology. And I really appreciate the partnership that my team has with Luis and his team, because I think you need both sides of this to really be effective. At the same time, I think in the business, you have to be talking about outcomes, as Luis said. You have to be talking about, what is the experience we want our employees to have and what do we want them to get out of it, and not about technologies. Technologies are fun and exciting, but they run kind of in the background. And so, what we have to lead with the business is, what is this going to allow us to do? What kind of experience is it going to allow our people to have? And I think if you spend more time, and I don't know that, frankly, we've spent enough time having that conversation with some of our stakeholders, because I do believe if you get alignment on that, it makes a lot of the other stuff easier to figure out. I think I've always said this, I've seen cases where, it's technology leading the way in the processes. And, the reality is technology probably definitely moves faster than some of our core HR strategy and process development, but we do have to be really careful not to get too far out of step, because if it becomes just a technology initiative, that's where I think we lose out on the overall power, and we potentially sacrifice some of the longevity, because the technology will continue to change and we'll build on it.
Something I'd like to add about lessons learned here. Start with something. Do something and see what happens. Because when we first started, we actually did that. We were really good at sort of pushing a couple pilots internally, seeing what this looked like, learning basically about this new space. And then we used those learnings to continue to build up, and we became a little bit slower in the process of continuing to deploy, but now we had those tests. Yep. So piece of advice is just do something.
Yeah, and I think what Josh shared this morning about kind of like, the 3 scenarios of ways to get started, definitely apply to all of this. If there is a place where there's a particular problem, Luis mentioned Chevron New Energies. That's a classic example for us, because it didn't exist before. It's new skills. The jobs didn't exist before, so we can't have the job data. So it's a great place to start, or at least to talk about as a case example internally.
Yep.
No, and I love this, and we've got less than 30 seconds, and I wish we had 2 more hours to have this conversation. I'm sure we could keep the audience. It was fascinating listening to the insights, and thank you for the authenticity of what you talked about. One of the things I'm taking away here is sometimes you do have to go slow to go fast. Right? And I love the advice of let's pick a problem and go at it, right? Let's understand the change side is not a technology project. This is really much bigger, and you've got to engage those stakeholders. By the way, I learned a long time ago, if you ignore them, they don't go away. So you might as well just kind of like lean into it. So with that, fascinating conversation. Thank you for your time today. Hopefully we can continue to interview you as you progress on your journey, and we'll make this a regular habit here. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Bill.
Thank you.